Welcome to the round 12 game review between Ding Liren and Gukesh Maraju, where Ding, with the white pieces, had to bounce back, and they did it in style. Let's see what happened. Pawn c4, marking Ding's return to sticking with his guns, where he's clearly played this a lot, and this is his go-to weapon with white, so makes a lot of sense. And after e6, well, diverging from the reverse Sicilian, making a pawn chain, of course, very likely with d5 to follow up, and marking that after g3, d5, bishop g2, knight f6, knight f3, Gukesh could well have been happy with a safe and solid bishop e7, where it would be very safe and sound, castles kingside, perhaps play c6, even c5, develop their pieces logically, and it would have been a case of can Ding break that down, and of course Ding would have had many ideas there. However, Gukesh had other plans, much like Ding yesterday. In a very similar position, Gukesh played d4, and this is interesting. Firstly, the bishop's free to attack. Secondly, it locks down on some squares, but also could become a bit of a vulnerability, and it very committal, as followed. Castles, knight c6, defending, and there followed e3. Well, firstly, if captures, both d takes and f takes are good, opening files. For example, f takes would open the f file, and after even queen d3, white can evict the queen on d3, the queen b3, not forcing, but potentially hoping for the a1 rook to be opened up. So this wouldn't be so great for black. If captures, it would give white's pieces a lot of activity. And if they don't capture, then perhaps e5, but this is potentially a risk. They've already played the e-pawn forwards in two separate moves, and after, for example, captures, rook e1 check, bishop e7, whilst black can castle away with d3, castles kingside, well, this would give Ding a target, and perhaps knight back to c2, b3, very similar to round 11, just yesterday's game, and this could become a big target. There's an open file for the e-rook, and, well, this might not be the best structure that Gukesh would have hoped for. So instead, if we retract to this moment here, Gukesh played bishop e7, just developing, getting ready, and Ding could now capture on d4, but there follows knight takes, and this would have potentially clarified some of the pressure in the center. Bishop or queen takes, both very good moves, putting pressure here. And after castles, black has a playable position at the very least. So, to keep pressure on, d3. And this was the first moment where Ding thought for a little while, just thinking through the various repercussions of the captures, the other waiting moves like a3, and so on and so forth. So d3 just clarifies things, stops d3 and stops queen d3 in all of the lines we just saw. Once again, if d takes e3, which is what was played, white does have a choice now, but because black is that much more ready to castle, f takes, well, then castles, and specifically because after d4, e5 is possible, where there follows, firstly, of course, if captures, this is begging for problems with knight g4 in 1,000 different lines. There follows d5, and the important move, e4, because, of course, if the knight had budged somewhere, perhaps backwards, the knight would win a pawn. So e4 is a critical variation here, where if the knight moves away, there's always knight e5 ideas, now escaping alongside gaining a tempo. f3 is not possible to block. And if there's a bit of a capture train, for example, this knight first, followed by this, the queens likely will trade off in between these moves or afterwards. And, for example, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, rook takes, bishop takes, rook b8, seemingly winning a pawn. White does have 6 versus 5, but because of the structural weaknesses combined with the two rooks and the sheer lack of development by white's pieces, knight to g4, knight possibly even to e5, defending, the lovely outpost. How can white shift this knight on e5? It'd be very tough to defend all the weaknesses when you have no pieces to do so. So it's roughly level. For that reason, all the way back here, well, after about 4 minutes of thought, bishop takes e3. Happened on the board, making sense. Developing, not clarifying anything, not committing the f f2 pawn, perhaps f4 could happen later on. And very quickly, e5. And notably, Gukesh has used about 3 minutes to Ding's 19. So clearly, Gukesh in some, once again, very hefty preparation here, having clearly been very familiar with this position. Well, knight c3, developing. About 10 minutes on this move, just, well, logically thinking through the plans. Obviously, knight d2 isn't possible, and knight a3 comes with a lot of risk, doubling the pawns and such. So knight c3 makes a lot of sense, developing, and after castles, very quickly again. Rook e1, and this was where Gukesh started to think. After about 12 minutes, h6 was played. And he later clarified that in this moment, he wasn't sure precisely what to do. Of course, the forcing move of d4 was likely what he'd been looking at in his preparation, where after captures, knight takes, and perhaps queen or bishop takes. Then c6, and this is very robust, blocking the bishop, and this bishop's likely to have a counter target. There might be some rook e1s and eventually queen to b3s, but ultimately black will be very happy here. So Ding very sensibly doesn't commit with d4 and simply just played rook e1, slightly flummoxing Gukesh, where after h6, well, a3, another cagey move, and of course, within 2 minutes, a5 was played, locking down on this. Now, this has a bit of a double-edged nature to it, because this gives up the b5 outpost, a6 is not possible, and c6 is very hard to do. Even if it is achieved, then e5 has to be dealt with in some ways, and of course, it's not possible at all with the knight on c6. So, those were all considerations with a5, but very quickly played because the alternative, for example, rook e8, also a good move, could be then b4, and this might be a little troublesome. Piece activity does matter. So for example, b5 here, the knight can jump to a5, it can even go back, and very similarly to yesterday's game by Ding, strike here. So these, well, were definitely on the minds of both players, but Gukesh played a5 to stop all of that, and it makes a lot of sense. But watch out for that outpost on b5, we'll see what happens. h3, a lot of time on this move, 8 minutes on h3, and both sides were clearly feeling around to see what might be good and bad, both sides having played some semi-waiting pawn moves both sides on both sides of the board, just clarifying on the wings. Bishop e6, sensible move, really saying if you play d4, c4 is a constant issue. It's certainly an idea, but not so great if you lose a pawn. And after king h2, another waiting move, almost prophylactically defending h3, so if queen d7, it's not as much of a target anymore, and both sides could play queen d7, queen d2, rook a d8, rook a d1, possibly even queen c8 here, queen c1, both sidestepping the potential rooks, staring at their queens, and then rook f8. And the issue in all these lines is black, having played a5 to stop b4, has given up this square, and this becomes increasingly topical in all these moments where it's very hard to scratch that knight away. It's very tough without any pawns to push it away. It's an outpost through and through. So instead, at this moment here, after king h2, well, perhaps rook e8 should have been played just to centralize the rook. But instead, Gukesh played rook b8, defending the pawn. And this is where perhaps it started going awry for Gukesh, because after queen c2, e2 is also possible, maybe looking at this, but c2 is a fantastic move. Sort of saying if you now play bishop f5, you've lost the tempo, and rook a d1, of course, is possible. And a very slow but steady queen c1, sort of having triangulated this queen round at the right moment after a timely rook here, then allows this pawn to push forwards. And that would be very good for Ding. White's already really putting pressure. Where is this queen going? The two files that are open or opening are controlled by White's rooks. c8 isn't particularly good. The one attack it has is defended already. Very nice, very computer-approved king h2. So already pressure on Gukesh. And it's worth noting, Gukesh's earlier time advantage has lessened. Ding with 55 minutes, still only 2 minutes or so per move, versus Gukesh's 40 minutes having been used, 80 minutes left. Well, keep an eye on it because it does get less and less and less. Rook e8, still with an hour plus. Very nice move, defending. And knight b5, using the aforementioned outpost and starting to place extreme pressure on the queen side. There's a lot firing at it, to say the least. And that's before we get to the pressure in the centre. Could well be that the tension is boiling. And of course, one pair of pawns have been traded off. One from the d file, one from the e file. Meanwhile, 4 minor pieces on both sides. So there's a lot of tension boiling under the surface. Bishop f5, the aforementioned pin. Rook ad1, and a bit of a zigzag around. Knight d7. Now, the idea of this perhaps could be to do this, and it's worth noting, if black can, they will be playing bishop f6, knight f8 to e6, and d4 is their square. It's never moving. But with, for now, this knight here, of course, that's 3, and it will be 4 if this rook were to connect. That's 4 pieces defending d4, and black is not quite in a fit state to do it. It takes 1, 2, and 3 moves to fully defend d4. So after queen d2, just with the plan of eyeing up this square, threatening d4, in a lot of variations, if d4, e4, then white retains their centre, the knight reroutes to the f4 square, or potentially even plays f3 and reroutes back this way, and this pawn just sticks out like a sore thumb, or is a hook for the f2 pawn. So that's potentially not a good position. And if that's not a good position, capturing, opening the queen and the rooks up might also not be a good position. So perhaps Gukesh is already a little bit worse. Knight c5 would have been an interesting try, but then d4 comes with tempo, and if the knight comes into d3, there's a very nice knight takes e5 opening up for everything. And even if knight takes e1, queen takes back, and once again, the rook looking down at this queen, very, very powerful. If, for example, captures, then d takes, albeit the exchange down, queen can zip into a5, and, well, there's a lot of pressure on the queen side. So already the tactic's starting to work in Ding's favour. So knight c5 possibly sort of helps d4 happen. So bishop g6, just to avoid, keep it defended, avoid any potential strikes at it. And d4, the strike occurs anyway. Forcing is a strong word, but if, for example, captures, this is the point. c7 starts to drop if rook to c8 to defend. Then knight f takes d4, and I think we know who is winning at this point. It's very, very tough to defend. Perhaps the best line would be like so, where white wins a pawn, is on the rooks open up, the queen side collapses. That may well be all she wrote. For that reason, e4 after d4, just keeping it closed. But as mentioned earlier, knight g1 starts to bounce back around. And also now there's a pawn hook on e4, so pawn f3 forces a response. Either it will be captured and that leads to consequences, or if it captures, the knight could come back, and obviously in the centre, it's right back where it was, doing good things. And or the bishop is opened up with evident play against the queenside, and need I say more. So e4 meant to be kind of a block, but it's more of a punching bag for the white's pieces, this bishop and so on. And after knight b6, that's very much seen. Queen c3 played by Ding. And it's worth noting, if f5, which might well be one of the best moves, the problem is f3, of course, black's trying to maintain this, but now the bishop's undefended, which means any version of this queen and bishop antagonism on the diagonal there is going to really favour white, with this being an issue. And also the bishop, for example, after rook c8, defending this very annoying weakness, thanks to the very nice knight, well then captures, knight e2, perhaps bishop h5, stopping it getting to f4, where it will be very annoying, coming into the centre and threatening various things. But now just bishop f4, and this bishop cannot defend, and it suddenly can't defend the dark squares. And this is getting very, very tricky for black, having overextended everywhere, really. The centre, white's pawn centre is very strong. The wing, if only pawns could move backwards. Very, very tricky to play in this position. So at this moment, queen c3, instead of f5, bishop f6 was played, but now, of course, f5 cannot be played. Knight e2 is possible, but queen c2 was played by Ding Liren, placing pressure, slight Schwissenzuck, having from d2 to c3 to c2. Well, now f5 is not possible. It's worth saying, once again, because of this very nice knight, this is defended thrice, plenty of times, or just enough to repel the 3 attackers, and, well, white's almost just sitting on their position, slowly coming back out, and because this is very locked, bishop in the way, like so, the pawn on a5 wishes it was on a6, and because of all that, it's very tough. Black is the one facing white, targeting various pawns. Even a5 is a target, whereas d4 and c4 are the only targets, and they're under very much lock and key in the white position. It's a very tricky position. Now a4, grabbing space. Well, it's worth saying if c5, well, squares rather than material. It's better to have activity and lose a pawn if you have things to do. This knight suddenly might well be quite a solid outpost. c6 will happen in some lines, although watching out for knight d6 and octopus knight, and this could be a lifeline for black. So absolutely not. c5 was not done, not breaking ranks, leaving these pawns, just controlling the center. Control is better than material very, very often. Knight e2, talking of control, bringing back the knight. Of course, f3, not happening as much, not with this, certainly staring at the queen. And bishop g5, and it's worth saying that around this moment, Ding Liren had played an almost perfect game with 99% or more accuracy, and well, it really shows because the knight is just doing a superb job. This knight is rerouted around. The structure hugely favours white. There's no real weaknesses and a lot of potential, a lot of kinetic energy ready to spill over, as we will see. Knight f4, declining the trade. If captures, this would reduce the tension, and after pawn takes, white's no better. f4 is no longer possible. For sure, this knight could come to c3, but then what's it actually doing? And aside from that, c4 would drop. And amongst other things, there's a bunch of issues. So, reducing the tension, absolutely not in Ding's favour. And after knight f4, well, bishop captured. It's worth saying, had the bishop retreated, then now c5 is more possible because this is eyed up, and the straight up captures, captures, and captures. Again, this knight is very, very good. Wins the exchange or more. So since knight d5 is not possible, perhaps knight d7, but now the pawn drops and we haven't given up the key square. We'll very likely push d5 in the near future, amongst other things, and white's a pawn up, likely to have a lovely pawn pyramid there, with all the perks of a very, very nice position nonetheless. For that reason, black captured on f4, but this is more an indictment of how tricky the position is becoming for Gukesh, because after bishop takes f4, within 4 seconds that was played, striking here, well, perhaps Gukesh could have tried e3, but after just queen c2, ignoring f2 because of rook f1, defending against this pawn, c7 still is dropping, and where are the targets? These thoroughly defend, even if, for example, queen e7 trying to break in, the pawn just drops before it can do anything, and then all these issues remain, and white is essentially winning. The only way is to tie themselves up into knots and defend, but then the pawn marches forwards, knight could go to here, but then d6, and everything crashes open. Very hard to maintain anything, frankly, right now. The best might well be to give up the exchange without losing the knight. As a result, after bishop takes f4, e3 was not tried, and rook c8 just defending this weakness. But there followed queen c3, removing any discovered attack. And with this move, Ding is considered by computers to be completely winning, +3 nonetheless, and more. Because it's a very tangible +3 in the sense that, look at the pressure. The d5 pawn is ready to launch, a4 is just impossible to hold, while c7 is also a target. Black's pieces are tied down. These two almost Alekhine-like knights possibly are not doing so great. Meanwhile, white's piece is very much the opposite. They have targets, they're well placed. And, well, let's see what happened. Knight b8, retreating, hoping to mobilize the weakness. Maybe there's a world where the pawn could move to c5. Of course, once again, the two rooks would be saying a lot about that with an open file. But nonetheless, getting ready to mobilize the pawn. d5, nonetheless, opening up for more pieces. Of course, black has just conceded the bishop pair after the capturing on f4. And queen d7, it's worth noting, well, black has to try something. If queen e7, feel free to pause the video. There is a relative knockout blow here that white can start doing, and it really revolves around to check your checks and captures. Of course, the only check here is nonsense, but the capture of knight takes c7 allows rook takes and d6 forking. And the pawn gets dangerously close to queening, but more importantly, you win the exchange with rook d8 to follow in various variations aside from everything collapsing with c5 and so on. For that reason, queen d7 was played by Gukesh. Knight a6 is possible, but simply just queen d4, and it's incredibly hard to find squares for these knights, not allowing knight c5 by queen d4, so that wouldn't really go anywhere. Knights on the rim are dim, and it's on the rim on both cases. So queen d7, mobilizing the queen, maybe eyeing this up, preventing, of course, c5, which could become annoying if it was allowed. And d6, trying to say to that queen, you're not going anywhere. If you start moving away, c7 drops. Well, for that reason, black closed it down. c6 is possible, but it forces what white wants to play anyway. And now c5 by white is a possibility. So that's not very good. So c5, probably the best move by black given the circumstances. But it does not prevent knight c7, the best move played by Ding. Well, of course, Ding has 11 minutes to Gukesh's 8 minutes. This was white's 28th move, meaning there's 12 moves or so to make for both sides. Not very long, but nonetheless, Ding has facilitated a fantastic position. Two rooks in the center, plethora of different targets even. Huge pawn on d6, huge knight on c7, and after rook f8, of course, black doesn't want to give up the exchange even for this pretty huge knight, and the pawn drops as a result. The rook could not really stay on the e-file without being lost. Now, perhaps black could have taken, but then the rook lifts, the knight comes out, and, well, already there's tactics opening up. If nothing else, bishop takes h6, and the pawn simply cannot be recaptured because of this check, and the queen has to give herself up because that's mate. So, and if the pawn can't be recaptured, it's a huge indictment of how terrible the position is, just bishop retreat, and the pawns start dropping, all because of the centralized play by white. So there's not too much black can do if captures. So they kept the bishop defending their king. Of course, if white captured, white would still be pretty well placed and probably winning, but opening the rook, maybe giving this pawn, or this pawn even giving some protection to the king. There's no need to do that. So Ding found a much better solution. After knight c6, just bishop g2. Twofold. Firstly, aiming for h4 and bishop h3, which would, of course, win the exchange. But also opening up for rook e7 and just declining the trade, keeping pressure on this c6 knight. There is nothing much black can do. They're in a complete bind now. Ding has thoroughly outplayed Gukesh here. There's almost no one moment where things started to completely snap. It was just a gradual build-up of the tension, and the moves Ding played have earned him this fantastic, fabulous position. Let's see how he finished it off. Of course, with the time constraints, not necessarily a given that he wins this, but after knight d5, a very nice, classy retreat. It's not doing anything on c7, or not as much as it is on d5, where it's threatening to come here, attack the knight. Semi-compelling, knight takes d5, and after c takes, a second d-pawn. Double pawns, if the one in front can be defended, then often they're not so bad. But more importantly, this attacks the knight. The knight's retreated. Of course, if it comes forwards, it's probably lost after this, and the knight has to strand itself on b3. Not looking so great, so retreating and digging in deep. But after queen takes c5 anyway, rook c8, the queen retreated to d4, very central, and this rook is coming to e7. And indeed, after knight a6, there it landed, rook e7. And at this point, Ding Liren is almost certainly going to win this game. Queen to b5, evading the attack. d7, possibly the rook could come here, but bishop d6, superb trapping of the knight. On a6, can't really move anywhere. Meanwhile, this is defended, of course. If the captures happen, this rook drops. There's no real way out of this. It's just a bind. For that reason, rook remained active. And here, even possible is queen takes c4 because of rook e8 and the queen is forced. The queen cannot come to c7 because of this, and for that reason, if we put that on the board, this would have simply won. But we cannot blame Ding for this. Queen to e3 was played, just safety first. There's no need to sacrifice the queen, especially with the time constraints. That could lead to disaster. Rook c2, cool. Bishop d6 first, the aforementioned trapping of this. And now after f6. Well, feel free to pause the video to see how Ding Liren forced resignation on the next turn. And of course, the answer was rook takes g7, check your checks. The reason being, this is the final piece defending d8. And so after, had Gukesh played it, king takes g7, bishop takes check, king's got to move or capture, and then of course the second queen comes on, and mate will follow. So a very nice finish. Of course, f6 was the final straw that broke the camel's back, but there's not too much that can be done regardless. The pawn will be queening with rook e8 and such. Well, a fantastically played game by Ding Liren, completely outplaying his young opponent, evening the score 6-all. Well, it is a rest day tomorrow, of course, and there's 2 games remaining in the main match, and if they get one apiece, 2 draws, or a win each in those 2 remaining games, which is now guaranteed, there will be 2 games left of the match. There will be tie breaks on Friday. Well, hope you enjoyed that. A fantastically played game by both, and do stay tuned for the next round. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Cheers.